Part of the thing about affirmative action is, as a black person, you never really know whether it's affecting you. So I just graduated from Columbia University, and I suspect that I would have gotten in if I were white or Asian, but I don't actually know that as a matter of fact.
Affirmative action programs increase access specifically for underrepresented groups. So that's why it's so important.
When I went to Harvard, I knew that affirmative action played a role in my admission. And I thought that was fair because I thought it was bringing me up to the starting line.
There's this myth that it's just about how well you did on a test. And the thing is that merit is much more complicated.
If one school is more concerned about musical ability, fine. What concerns people is preferential treatment based on race.
There's a conundrum in this area of affirmative action. The conundrum is, in order to be totally successful, do we need to discriminate?
When I started teaching in 1994, not only was I the first Latina ever hired at the law school here, I was the second ever hired on the tenure track of any University of California law school. And when I was tenured in 2000, 6 years later, I was only the second person, Hispanic woman, ever tenured at any top 20 law school. Albuquerque at the time that I was growing up in the 70s was pretty much a segregated city. The valleys along the Rio Grande, it was all Chicano kids, Mexican American. And then in the heights, as you went up toward the mountains, it was all white. So I grew up in this working class area, and my high school was, it'd be this kind of thing where the small number of white kids in my high school, they were all in the advanced classes. And then there'd be a couple of us Mexican American kids who were in those classes. But then all the other Mexican American kids would be basically, taking shop or auto repair or, and not very many kids from my high school went to college. When I went to Harvard, I knew that affirmative action played a role in my admission. And I thought that was fair because I thought it was bringing me up to the starting line. I thrived there. That doesn't mean it was easy for me. It wasn't, because the classmates that I had who had gone to either really good public schools in the suburbs, right? And then the kids who went to private schools, they had a much better education, than I did. But I don't think they worked as hard as I did, and I don't know that they learned as much. Like, my learning curve was so steep. I was never ashamed. I never felt any stigma. I felt proud that, that I had gotten there. First time that affirmative action came into the lexicon was actually in a speech that President Lyndon B. Johnson gave. The analogy he used was that there was a race, and in that foot race, there was one competitor who was at the starting line and another competitor who was 10 feet behind, and how unfair that race was structured, right? And in particular, the economic, social legacy of slavery, which transformed into Jim Crow segregation, right? Because of that legacy, we weren't all starting at that same mark. So the idea of affirmative action was, let's allow everyone to have the same opportunity.
I was a beneficiary in a change of outreach which occurred at post the assassinations of Martin Luther King and other leaders, where beginning, I believe, in 1969 and 1970 and 1971, that time frame, the elite institutions of the United States began to aggressively court people of color. Cornell wasn't on my mind when I sat down and thought about applying to school. They reached out to me, through the programs that were put in place to go out to feeder high schools and find what I'll describe as the best and brightest at the time for kids of color. I went to an elite Philadelphia high school called Central. And so I just got pulled out of class one day and summoned to a meeting. They put me in an old beat up van that was that needed fixing because the elements were getting through. I met a guy from Cornell in a program they had at the time, and I loved it and applied and got in. I then came out to Los Angeles, worked for a law firm. I didn't make partner at the law firm. To make it to the C-suite of a Fortune 100 company is a big deal, and that happened to me. My dad passed away a couple years after I graduated, so he didn't get to see all of this, and that's like a regret that he didn't get to see all of it. But I'm sure he's looking down and he's proud. But there's an argument's been made that the concept of affirmative action burdens kids with a stigma or a jacket of you were in point of fact admitted because of a status and not because of stature. There's a conundrum in this area of affirmative action. The conundrum is, in order to be totally successful, do we need to discriminate?
Affirmative action today in college admissions is definitely practiced differently than it was initially in the 1960s and 70s. So the myths around affirmative action today, especially within college admissions, is that it's a racial quota, that there are set-asides for underrepresented minorities, namely Black, Latinx, and Indigenous students. However, that was outlawed, declared unconstitutional by the Supreme Court in 1978 in a case called UC Regents versus Bakke. Justice Powell said not only were quotas unconstitutional, colleges and universities can consider race in their admissions policies, but only for the purpose of advancing diversity for their educational missions.
Diversity to Powell meant your motivation has to be that you believe that students learn better in a situation where there is racial diversity and diversity of all kinds. Then over the course of the next 10 or 25 years, another case reached the Supreme Court, two cases actually. Both of them were directed against the University of Michigan. At the time, the University of Michigan was granting very large preferences to students who were African American, The Supreme Court, they essentially said, if you make it too clear, if you do it with strict numbers, we won't allow that. but as long as the numbers aren't strict, you can give preferential treatment.
Today, colleges and universities use a holistic admissions process where they might look at race, but they'd also look at geography, right? Are you from, in my case, New Mexico? But they would look at race, but like, was I a debate champion? Yes, give her points for that, right? And all these various things. And so that model of affirmative action being about diversifying became entrenched in that 1978 opinion, I think in a way that nobody would have predicted. Nobody would have predicted that that was going to be the only reason for affirmative action. Because remember, the original reason that President Johnson had laid out was, look, that race isn't fair because of that past discrimination. But instead of talking about that, and redressing that structural racism, that inequality in society, we talk about diversity.
Today, a lot of civil rights advocates have moved to calling it race-conscious admissions rather than affirmative action because it has been very watered down. If the problem is systemic racism and racial discrimination and racial inequities, the only way to solve those problems is to have explicit policies that recognize them as problems. You can't solve something like racism without one saying it's a problem. And we will act in ways through our policy and practices to address it and to dismantle it.
Affirmative action programs in education have been demonstrated to increase diversity and increase access, specifically for underrepresented groups. So that's why it's so important. And especially now, if we as a nation are serious about creating equity and justice, we have to institute programs that have been proven to create more equity, in our schools, in our colleges, and in our workplaces. Equity, to me, looks like our state colleges, our flagship state universities, being representative, relatively speaking, of the demographics of the state. Particularly Black and brown students are far and away typically underrepresented at the flagship institutions and then overrepresented in the more lower tier institutions, the more community colleges and universities. But I think in order for us to get to that point, we're going to have to recognize these gross inequities between groups. Why is it that on average, Black and brown students are getting lower scores on SAT and ACT exams? Those who typically score higher on SAT exams, you see this relationship between higher scores and the higher wealth of the parents of the test takers. And then you peel deeper and you find that white Americans have 10 times more wealth, the median wealth, than Black people. You also find from coast to coast that these test prep companies are concentrated in white and Asian neighborhoods.
I guess what I would say is I think we should deconstruct this notion that, say, your SAT score is the best measure of merit. Most schools, public schools in the United States, are geographically arranged, and yet we know that that's going to perpetuate racial segregation because we live in a racially segregated society. And that segregation isn't the product of something way, way long ago. I mean, in Los Angeles, Asian Americans and Mexican Americans and African Americans couldn't live in many parts of Los Angeles. They were prohibited from buying property in those places. And so, for example, they went to Compton, or they went to East LA, or they lived in downtown, right? So I guess what I would say, when you take student A and you take student B, and student A went to Pacific Palisades School which was their neighborhood school, and student B went to Compton Unified, and you look at their SAT score, right? I would say, actually, that's comparing apples and oranges, right? So maybe this student from Compton Unified, maybe their SAT score is lower, but for them to get that score, they've done so much more. So there's some really, really kind of baked in inequality in our system.
Part of the thing about affirmative action is, as a Black person, you never really know whether it's affecting you. So I just graduated from Columbia University, and I suspect that I would have gotten in if I were white or Asian, but I don't actually know that as a matter of fact. For some Black people, that creates this sort of sense of imposter syndrome. Do I really belong here? Did I get in on the merits of my talent? My parents sent me to a short SAT prep course at the local high school. And I remember when I took a practice test, the teacher said to me, based on your score and the fact that you're Black, you're gonna get into any college you want when it comes time to apply to colleges in 4 years or whatever. And I know what I'm supposed to think about that is that it was at minimum tone deaf of her to say that, and at most actually racist to assume that I'm going to get into college because I'm Black. And now, as a person who was very nice to me and had my best interests at heart, telling me something true about the current system of college admissions, which is that being Black and having a certain score is not the same as being Asian and having a certain score. It's not the same as being white and having a certain score, at least at the very elite universities, at the Harvards and Princetons and Columbias. So when we're talking about this policy, we're already talking about the elite of Black people. People who for the most part, we're not really thinking of when we think of the problem of lack of preparedness and inner city poverty and the trials and tribulations of what it means to grow up poor and Black. The vast majority of Black kids, of Black teens, are either not going to college to begin with, either didn't finish high school, or they're going to a big state college or something else that doesn't really practice affirmative action. Now, the question is, can affirmative action be viewed as just one of many tools in the fight against institutional racism? Now, the obvious objection, the objection that is so obvious that people simply roll their eyes when you say it, is how is it combating racism to racially discriminate? Even if it's for virtuous reasons, I personally cannot hold those beliefs and feel like my mind is coherent, but it seems to me a lot of people can.
The Justice Department weighed in today on a discrimination lawsuit against Harvard University. The suit claims the school illegally limits the number of Asians admitted.
Harvard's race-based admissions process significantly disadvantages Asian American applicants.
The SSFA is alleging that Harvard is using processes of race-conscious admissions that go beyond what the Supreme Court has allowed. In the fall of 2018, it went to trial on the actual factual issue, whether what Harvard was doing was using things like racial quotas and racial balancing, which are not allowed on the Supreme Court standard. There were a number of facts that came out that looked quite bad for Harvard. In general, Asian students had higher scores on the metrics, except for one number, which was the personality rating. And the admissions office had given Asian students lower personality ratings than white students, even though white students had lower scores than Asians on all of the other metrics.
The funny thing about Harvard is that they evidently believe that they have too many Asian Americans, that too many Asian Americans qualify for admissions.
Nearly 200 Harvard students gathered at Harvard Square to fight for affirmative action and an inclusive admission process.
I think it's very important to separate out two different questions. One, which was the question that was litigated at trial, which is whether Harvard engaged in intentional discrimination against Asian Americans. And the second, whether Harvard or any other school is permitted to use race-conscious affirmative action. They really are separate and distinct questions, but the general public has really mixed them up and made them seem like they're one and the same. Discrimination against Asian Americans or any other racial group on intentional grounds is simply not permitted, regardless of the question of affirmative action. Of course, intentional discrimination is very, very difficult to prove.
If one school is more concerned about musical ability, fine. If another school cares more about leadership ability, that's fine. If one school thinks that high school GPAs are better predictors than standardized test scores, that's great. They should all have their own admissions policies. And I believe very firmly that we should have diversity, shall we say, among colleges and universities in the kinds of admissions policies that they have. I think the fundamental point, and I think it's fundamental to what we believe as Americans, is that race should not be among the factors.
In California, there was a proposition back in 1996 that basically banned the application of affirmative action. I was 6 years old when that passed, so I have never lived through affirmative action. To define someone and attribute any value or extra or negative on being a minority for college admissions, I think a lot of people really looked at that and said, this is not necessarily what I want for my students or my children. I think Latinos, being the fastest population to be growing in the state of California nationally, they're seeing the growing numbers and they're understanding that we as Latinos have a stronger power and we're becoming more of a, not the majority yet, but we're well on our way. And when Latinos do become the majority, what does that mean for my students? What does that mean for my kids and for our education system? Are we then going to be on the receiving end of a quota that's lower than what we're actually representative of or what we can actually do? This idea that there would be some sort of a ceiling for any of us, I think really kind of terrified a lot of voters, especially Latino voters who said, hey, I think we can do this without that, and I don't want to limit my kids' potential to be able to go to UCLA or UC Berkeley or another school. I think diversity is one of our strengths as a country, as a state. I mean, we live in one of the most diverse states, so it's definitely welcome. For example, UCLA and the UC system going out and diversifying their applicant pool is going to make that campus stronger, period. But I don't think that should necessarily be a mandate by the government.
What happened to the UC system, in which you saw this precipitous decline, specifically in the number of Black students at the UC schools. And it's undeniable that that's the result of the ban on affirmative action. I am all for whatever is the justification for supporting a policy that has been proven to create more equity. Whether we're pushing for diversity or whether we're pushing for reparations, I'm just focused on the outcome. To me, the end goal is to ensure that whatever groups have the least amount of resources in their homes, have the most amount of resources in their communities, in their schools, in their places of advancement.
Of course we want programs that will benefit people who are at a genuine disadvantage. Just don't define disadvantage in terms of race, sex, ethnicity, national origin.
The way the conversation is framed, it's that if you're for affirmative action, you're pro-Black people. And if you're against it, you're pro-white people. And there is nowhere to stand in the conversation to be a humanist, to be pro all people, and trying to find principles on which to base a multiracial society that are fair, that are grounded in the desire to see people not as mere stand-ins for the race they happen to be born into, but as individuals.
I remember hearing at least one teacher say to me, "It's too bad you're not Black, because maybe you would get into a more selective college." I used to wonder whether affirmative action was a preference, whether it was a way that just boiled down someone's life story to just a checkbox. And through my research, I found that it's not. In college admissions in particular, it's really about seeing a person for who they are and where they came from and what that story brings to understanding their talents.
So this is a not so recent picture of all of us. Princeton, Stanford, JD, MBA, Yale, Stanford, JD. I was able to chart a career that I'm proud of. Married a wonderful woman. I've got 3 kids who have overachieved, But the point of me talking about my success or the success of people who I walk the halls with is that those stories need to continue. Programs that allow that, are invaluable. They're invaluable. We make America better.
Hey, thanks for checking out CBSN Originals on YouTube. If you want to watch more documentaries, download the free CBS News app on your phone, tablet, smart TV, or any streaming device. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel by clicking down here. Thanks for watching.